The moments leading up to the M Company's engagement were fraught with tension as the soldiers moved into position. The air was thick with anticipation, and every sound seemed magnified by the quiet prairie that stretched before them. The flankers, a key component of their strategy, often seemed to disappear from most records, blending into the fog of war that typically obscures the finer details of combat. The fog, both literal and figurative, concealed more than just the landscape. It buried the truth of what really happened during those crucial moments that, for years, historians have speculated on the role these flankers played in the unfolding battle. Some advanced further than others had realized, perhaps reaching the outskirts of the village itself. This is supported by the scattered evidence, though it remains unclear whether they moved with intent or became disoriented in the chaos. What's more intriguing is the possibility that some soldiers from the initial group of 10 to 15 men stayed together, suggesting a coherent push beyond the main force. But ambiguity surrounds their actions. Were there defectors who broke ranks? Or did Captain Ryan, known for his strategic mind but criticized for his opaque leadership style, only send part of the unit into the woods, keeping the others under his control? Ryan's memoirs, once considered a valuable historical document, have since been criticized for their lack of detail. His narrative condenses events to a point where key moments are omitted entirely, leaving many questions unanswered. It's difficult to ascertain if this was a deliberate act of omission or simply a result of memory's natural erosion over time. Still, based on available accounts, Ryan himself did not follow his squad into the timber. He stayed behind with the main force of M Company, watching as his men disappeared into the shadows of the forest, while the rest of the company moved forward across the open prairie, heading directly toward the battle line. One figure whose voice disrupts this tidy narrative is Private Wilbur, whose recounting of events adds a layer of complexity to Ryan's role. Wilbur mentioned Ryan's pivotal involvement to Walter Camp, a well-respected researcher of military history, especially the Custer campaigns. And yet, in an interesting twist, Ryan's own memoirs, as well as newspaper articles from 1923 published in both the Hardin Tribune and the Billings Gazette, omit this key detail. Wilbur's testimony not only challenges the official narrative, but raises questions about the deliberate rewriting of history. Was Ryan attempting to craft a particular legacy for himself? Or did these omissions arise from an unconscious suppression of traumatic memories? Further complicating the story, historian Richard Hardorf, known for his meticulous work on the events of Custer's campaign, highlighted a telling contradiction. He noted that Ryan had informed Walter Camp that he accompanied the soldiers to the skirmish line, but notably, he stopped short of entering the woods. The woods, it seemed, were a barrier that even the most hardened soldiers hesitated to cross. This subtle distinction is crucial, revealing the layers of decision-making that shaped the flow of the battle. Meanwhile, Private William Morris, another soldier present at the skirmish, had his own story to tell. In his account, Major Reno directed Captain French to send a scouting party of 10 men from the right side of the troop to investigate the woods before the remaining troopers could move their horses to cover. Morris was among the 10 selected for this perilous task. It was a moment heavy with uncertainty. No one knew what lay beyond the timberline. The fear was palpable, but there was also a grim resolve among the soldiers. They were trained to act without hesitation, to suppress their fear in the face of the unknown. Under the command of First Sergeant Sunkin and Captain Ryan, the 10 men charged toward the woods. The adrenaline in their veins made their hearts race, and every sound of the rustling leaves felt like an impending ambush. The formation spread out as they entered the woods in skirmish formation, each man trying to cover his comrades' blind spots. The sun cast long shadows across the forest floor, creating an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere as they moved deeper into the timber. Every branch that snapped underfoot or brush that rustled in the wind was cause for alarm. The soldiers' eyes darted around, searching for any sign of native forces. But the woods remained silent. No ajos, no arqueries, no ambush. The quiet was unnerving, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. After a few tense minutes of searching, the men realized they were alone, or so it seemed. There was no sign of the native forces they had been sent to scout, no indication of a forthcoming attack. It was as if the enemy had vanished into thin air, or worse, had never been there in the first place. The decision was made to return to the main unit. Their reconnaissance mission had yielded nothing, but the sense of unease lingered. Had they missed something? Was there an unseen enemy watching them from the shadows? These thoughts plagued the soldiers as they regrouped with the rest of the company. Captain Ryan, observing from the edge of the woods, seemed unfazed by the lack of results, though one could only speculate what went through his mind in those moments. Venture into the woods was a critical error, or perhaps it was a calculated move, one meant to protect the majority of his men from a potential ambush that never materialized. As the day wore on and the battle escalated, M Company's movements became more erratic. The confusion of war blurred the lines between strategy and chaos, and the truth of what happened to those flankers will likely remain shrouded in mystery. What is clear, however, is that the choices made in those moments, by Ryan, by Major Reno, in hindsight, many historians view this as a missed opportunity, a chance to secure a crucial advantage that slipped through. M Company's fingers, the flankers, lost in the fog of war, could have played a decisive role had they pressed on or communicated more effectively with the main force. Perhaps Ryan's decision to stay back, his reluctance to soldiers who ventured into the woods, had ripple effects that shaped the course of the engagement. Ryan's legacy, like that of many officers involved in these campaigns, is marked by contradiction. Was he a competent leader who made difficult but necessary decisions to protect his men? Or was he a cautious commander whose hesitancy cost them a strategic advantage? The accounts of men like Wilbur and Morris complicate the narrative, suggesting that Ryan's role was more active than he himself claimed. Whether these omissions in his memoirs were intentional or not, they left gaps in the historical record that have invited decades of speculation. As the dust settled after the battle, questions about that day lingered. What really happened in the woods? Did the native forces retreat before the soldiers arrived, or had they cleverly evaded detection? And most importantly, could the outcome of the engagement have been different had M Company's flankers pressed on further? These are questions that continue to haunt historians. Much like the soldiers of M Company were haunted by the fog of war that enveloped them on that fateful day. As Lieutenant Varnum recalled, by the time Major Reno's command halted, the soldiers had covered nearly 2 miles. The pace was frantic, taking only 15 to 20 minutes, but those minutes stretched endlessly in the minds of the men, each step bringing them closer to an inevitable clash. Reno's soldiers, dismounting in practiced fashion, knew the weight of what awaited them. Varnum, along with Lieutenant Hare, rode ahead to assess the terrain. As scouts were nowhere to be found, anxiety grew in the ranks. It was already 1:37 p.m. when Varnum returned to report to Captain Moylan. What he described painted a grim picture of what was to come. In the distance, Varnum spotted the Gray Horse Company, part of Compton's command under Custer, silhouetted on the distant bluffs. Their presence offered a glimmer of hope that reinforcements were near, but there was little time to dwell on that thought. His eyes were drawn to the site of teepees, approximately 800 yards from the line Reno's men were forming. The village, nestled near a bend in the river, appeared deceptively peaceful, but Varnum knew better. The dust rising from the plains, kicked up by the hooves of mounted warriors, was a harbinger of the storm gathering on the horizon. Hare, watching the troops move into position near the timberline, understood the gravity of the situation. The decision to dismount Reno's troops had likely saved their lives, for had they continued advancing blindly, they would have been swallowed by the wave of native warriors now rushing to defend their home. There was no turning back and no other options for retreat. The warriors, some 400 to 500 strong, were emerging from a coulee, a hidden ravine that served as a natural cover for their advance. Their organized assault was underway, and Reno's men, though in formation, faced a rapidly growing force with sheer numbers on their side. For a moment, Hare watched in disbelief as a group of about 50 native warriors rode boldly up and down, their horses moving with wild grace as they fired sporadic shots at Reno's command. It was an unnerving sight, but there was a larger force looming in the distance. hundreds more warriors were preparing to strike. The growing dust cloud, once a faint signal of their arrival, now darkened the skies above. The battle was no longer a distant fear. It had arrived in full force, and Reno's men were about to be swept up in its fury. By the time the skirmish line was set up, the situation had grown increasingly dire. The number of native fighters now swelled to between 200 and 300, with more joining the fray as each minute passed. The tension was palpable, and every man in Reno's command knew that the odds were stacked against them. They halted about 150 yards from the river, the sharp bend in the creek providing a partial shield, but it also confined their movements. The bend, though a natural defense, would prove to be both a blessing and a curse as the battle progressed. From their position, they could see the village just across the river bend. The nearest teepees were a mere 75 to 100 yards away, almost within striking distance. Private Davern, positioned along the skirmish line, recalled how the native warriors began to flank the left side of Reno's command. Their movements were methodical but individual, a tactical approach designed to confuse and disorient. Rather than advancing in large groups, the warriors moved one by one, each taking advantage of the terrain and using natural cover to their advantage. The soldiers on the skirmish line fired when they could, but the warriors were elusive, darting in and out of view with the agility of seasoned fighters who knew the land better than anyone. The sound of gunfire erupted sporadically, echoing across the river and through the trees. As the battle raged on, the tension built to an unbearable degree. Reno's men held their ground, but it was clear that they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The native fighters had the upper hand, both in numbers and in their knowledge of the terrain. For every warrior that fell, two more seemed to take their place, filling the gaps in the line with a relentless, determined ferocity. From his vantage point, Hare saw that the skirmish line was holding, but just barely. The relentless pressure from the native forces was beginning to take its toll on the soldiers. Some of the men were visibly shaken, their hands trembling as they reloaded their rifles, their faces pale with the realization that this might be their final stand. The native warriors, sensing the soldiers' growing fear, pressed their advantage, moving ever closer to the line. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of gunpowder, making it difficult for the soldiers to see more than a few yards ahead. Varnum, stationed near Captain Moylan, kept a close watch on the unfolding chaos. The sight of the warriors advancing on the left flank sent a chill down his spine. They were trying to surround the command, to close the trap. He knew that if Reno didn't act quickly, they would be overwhelmed. His thoughts turned to the Gray Horse Company, still visible on the distant bluffs. Were they aware of the dire situation unfolding below? Would they come to their aid in time? Or would Reno's men be left to face the brunt of the native assault alone? Meanwhile, on the skirmish line, Private Davern and his fellow soldiers fought valiantly to hold their position. The native warriors, though fierce, seemed to be testing the line rather than launching a full assault. They moved with purpose, but not recklessly, gauging the soldiers' responses with each pass. It was a battle of wills as much as it was a physical fight, with both sides waiting for the other to make a mistake. For Reno's men, the pressure was almost unbearable. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, and the weight of the moment pressed down on them like a vice. At 150 yards from the river, Reno's men could see the village in tantalizing detail. The teepees stood silent, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding just yards away. The smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily into the air, mixing with the dust and gunpowder to create an eerie, otherworldly scene. It was hard to believe that such a peaceful sight could exist in the midst of such violence. But the soldiers had no time to dwell on this irony. Their focus was on survival, on holding the line long enough for help to arrive, if it would arrive at all. The native warriors, emboldened by their growing numbers and the soldiers' apparent hesitation, began to press the attack. They advanced in waves, each one bolder than the last. The soldiers fired back with everything they had, but it was becoming increasingly clear that they were fighting a losing battle. The warriors' strategy of flanking the left side of the command was working, And soon the soldiers found themselves being pushed back, their line bending under the pressure. Hare watched in horror as the skirmish line began to falter. The men were fighting with everything they had, but it wasn't enough. The warriors were too many, and they were too skilled. Hare knew that if the line broke, Reno's command would be finished. He turned to Varnum, his face pale with fear. "We can't hold much longer," he said, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. Varnum nodded grimly. "We need reinforcements," he replied, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. But he knew as well as Hare did that reinforcements might not come. The Gray Horse Company, still distant on the bluffs, seemed frozen in place, either unaware or unwilling to intervene.